everyone, and welcome to the first installment of our new video series, Finding Labubu, brought to you by Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis. I am Lizzi Li, a fellow on the Chinese economy here at CCA. In this series, we'll be exploring how a new wave of entrepreneur-driven products and services is reshaping China's domestic consumer landscape, and perhaps more importantly, how they are creating global icons and cultural phenomena. From boba chains to gaming sensations like Black Myth Wukong, these stories are changing how the world perceives China. And today we're starting with one of the strangest and perhaps most fascinating examples, Labubu, the oddball figurine that has propelled Pop Mart into global spotlight. Joining me today is someone who's been tracking this up close, Ivy Yang, founder and CEO of Wavelet Strategy, who advises Chinese companies on overseas expansion. And Ivy has just returned from a trip to China, so she will bring some fresh on the ground insight to our audience. Let's jump right in. Ivy, great to see you.
Great to see you too, Lizzie.
And many in this audience may know Labubu as an odd-looking rabbit-like toy, right, showing up on your Instagram feeds. Can you just start by situating it for us? What exactly is Labubu? What is Pop Mart, the company behind Labubu, and why should U.S. policymakers and executives care about Labubu?
Yeah, Labubu is something that was created by artist Casey Lon back in 2015. And I say that what really catapulted into global awareness is that it was scaled by Pop Mart in a really big way. It became part of our kind of public consciousness because Blackpink's Lisa talked about her kind of addiction to buying Pop Mart, Labubus, and Crybabies, and she would carry it on her Louis Vuitton bags, and then it just suddenly became this phenomenon. But I think it's worth noting that Pop Mart has been around since 2010, and Labubu has been around for a decade already. Pop Mart began as a distribution toy retailer. It distributed the Japanese Dreams toy Sony Angels. And then in 2016, it pivoted to selling collectible toys and figurines in a blind box format. And one of its kind of first IP successes was the Molly, which is still a huge revenue contributor to Pop Mart, and it really kickstarted the blind box craze. It IPO'd in Hong Kong in 2010, and today is valued at 49 billion USD Pop Mart. And I think Pop Mart is such a fascinating success story because you think about Pop Mart in relation to Labubu, but there's also lots of IPs and character that's developed, and it has very robust offline presence too. It operates around 1,000 stores globally with around 400 and some more in China, like in June 2025. It's serious expanding. 40% of its revenue is now outside of China, and APAC is about half of that global revenue, but it has clear ambition to grow the EU and US market to secure higher gross margins. So I think Pop Mart, it seems like it came from nowhere, but it's really been around for more than a decade.
Yeah, and Ivy, as you just mentioned, you've just been in China. What did you see in the malls, the stores, and among consumers that you think would explain Labubu's staying power? And what are, we as US observers missing if we only look at the financials or English language media coverage of Labubu and Pop Mart?
I think what's been talked a lot about is how Labubu and Pop Mart is related to this rise of emotional consumption, right? You're buying for the pure thrill of just some small thing, but that could yield a lot of fulfillment, feeling of satisfaction that you have this cool thing that you are part of this kind of pop culture moment. But what I observed in China, there are a couple of things. I think there is definitely, if you go to the malls, which is there are abundance of malls across first, second, third tier cities, there is an uneven revival. You don't see a lot of actual consumption happening. You see a lot of perusing. But what you will see on the lower floors or in the restaurants, there's a lot more foot traffic that are there. And there's also that disappearance of what I would call the aspirational luxury consumers. The white collar in first tier or second tier cities that used to save up for a Chanel bag now has really moved on to avoid kind of these large commitments and purchases. So those who like used to save up to buy these aspirational brands are largely gone. You see a lot of that consumer moving into, buying Labubus, buying these kind of emotional consumption type of experiences. You see this huge rise in the nostalgia economy, the concert and the music festivals uh, kind of realm. It's growing in exponential ways. If you look at the stats from 大麦, there's a huge rise in a lot of that concert economy. You would travel to a different city for the weekend just to see a 3 hour concert from someone you loved when you were a teenager or in college. Because I think people are now leaning more toward this long tail type of joy of like experiences of connecting with your emotional kind of consumption needs instead of just buying things. And you also see the shift toward more conservative consumptions. Laopu has been a huge story of late. People are buying not more gold, but the price of gold has increased because people are kind of moving toward that safe haven. You're buying less of those large life commitments, right? Including real estate, including even cars. But you are gravitating toward those smaller joys that there's a lot of certainty in.
Mm. Fantastic. And what really strikes me as interesting is that, unlike Nurja or Wukong, Labubu isn't rooted in this beautiful Chinese mythology per se. If anything, it's ugly, right? This is this weird, cute factor. You mentioned this changing landscape consumer culture, but can you help us understand the psyche that's driving the appeal of the weird, cute factor of Labubu a little better?
A part of the draw of Labubu is that I feel like a lot of people who buy it understand that there's actually no intrinsic utility of owning a plush toy. You could have one that you could put on your bag. You could have 12. Are you gonna put all 12 on your bag? So there's that, I guess, um, sense that, this is just, I'm doing it just for the sake of doing. Because in China, it's everything is a lot of it is moving toward a goal and getting things done. That speed of change and that speed of growth that's expected is of this very heightened level. But Labubu is just like you're doing something just because it's fun, because it's accessible, because it's also affordable. So you don't feel this intense guilt of saving up, of putting in the effort and then buying it. It's just something that is easy, affordable, and it yields emotional rewards. But at the same time, like if you walk into a Pop Mart store in China, it's not just your typical kind of female millennial Gen Z consumers. You see a lot of guys actually in the
Mm.
Pop Mart stores, and you see them kind of standing there and shaking these boxes. And that is because they're trying to find the secret edition and they're trying to find this because there are lots of tips and sharings about this. Is like by shaking it, you kind of can gauge the weight and the different nooks and that it hits, and then you could guess what model it is and etc. And people do that because there's also a very robust secondary resale
Mm.
market for these products. So the psyche is that if you get the secret edition that you really want, or the one character that you really want, great. Even if you don't get what you want and you get like five of the same, um, by in these blind boxes, you'll still be able to resell it. So there's literally no risk in buying and to continue to be part of this process because you think that there will always be a secondary market. You could sell it and you might even sell it for a premium because there's such hype around it. So the justification is that it's a very small wager for outsized
Mm.
emotional and potentially financial return.
Yeah. Fantastic. And I see some analysts, compare Pop Mart to Disney or Funko, right? Do you think that is that a helpful analogy, or is Pop Mart, creating or building something fundamentally different? What's the business model?
I think Wang Ning in previous interviews has said that, Pop Mart wants to be China's Disney.
Mhm.
And that narrative has evolved into Pop Mart, it wants to be the world's Pop Mart. I think that shift in the narrative is really fascinating because it illustrates that it's no longer trying to emulate a Disney, which, at the core, Pop Mart is a distribution network and a content factory. Disney is similarly a distribution network and also very strong in content creation. But I think what PopMart has done really well and iterated really well is that when you think about Labubu, when it first was created 10 years ago, the character looked very different from what it is today. It's the body is much elongated, it's less cute, it's not this kind of more innocuous, innocent looking character. It looked like a, forest genie or monster. So it's the iteration of the character itself because Pop Mart understands what the market demands and what the zeitgeist is, and to be able to expand beyond the product categories. If you go to a Pop Mart store now and you look at all the Labubu, because you will not never be able to buy a blind box Labubu in the store, even though it's decorated everywhere, but it's always sold out. But there's Labubu shaped candles. There's Labubu, like the head of a Labubu in a water bottle format. So it's moving toward more like in the utilitarian, functional product category beyond just an accessory that you could put on your bag or a mega version of a Labubu that you could only keep at home to enjoy. There are
Mhm.
lots of different formats in which the product has evolved. So in that sense, I think Pop Mart is very interesting compared to like a US like Funko, right? It's just really about the collectibles and the Disney, which is about that content. Very, very, very focused on the content. It is creating something of a different category in which there is the content, there is the distribution, there is the
Mhm.
IP ownership. There's also a lot of the utility of the th characters kind of existing in the world so that you could use it, you could look at it. There's so much you could do with it.
Fantastic. I mean, one critique I hear is that, oh, this is just about performing identity. It's just, a social market driven hype. It doesn't really have long-term value. It's not sustainable. Do you think Labubu or Pop Mart can get long-term consumer trust? Is it only a hype, or is it the start of something long-lasting?
I think, when Labubu, when Pop Mart first went IPO, it did really, really well. And then it actually went through a period of kind of the growth was tapering and you weren't sure if there was going to be this next big thing. And there was also a lot of crackdown on blind boxes because it's the potential for gambling and addiction and a lot of these things. And the policies was catching up in China to try to police this kind of whole industry of cards and blind boxes. But I think what Potmar has really succeeded in doing is a two-pronged approach, which is that it has continuously made existing IPs culturally stronger and more
Mhm.
relevant with additional product assortment possibilities. And also, it keeps on adding new IPs. It tests in the market and it manufactures hits because you have all this offline stores that are kind of in these very nice malls or on the shopping streets in which there's, a lot of people don't really buy big ticketed item, but you could always go into a Pop Mart store, which is an experience in itself, and buy something. So they continue to iterate and test the market through its offline channels, and it manufactures hits with staying power because it is very visceral what it's selling and what it's not selling. And in
Mm.
addition, it has a very strong online community. Membership in the Pop Mart world, it's really interesting, especially if you're in China. They the membership or part of being part of that community offers you a lot of early access to be able to buy characters that are really hard to get. Again, it's that you could get either get what you want or you can get something and then resell it because there's other people that want what you have. So it's manufacturing that desire. It's almost like a factory of manufacturing this emotional
Mm.
resonance, but also a very robust secondary market. And in that sense, it's very similar to kind of luxury second-hand goods markets, even though the ticket prices are much smaller.
Fascinating. And step back a little bit. What do you think Pop Mart's rise tell us about this new generation of Chinese entrepreneurs or Chinese entrepreneurial culture in general? If we think about, Black Myth Wukong, Pop Mart, Labubu, these are not stereotypical, cost-cutting Chinese manufacturers, right? The Yiwu, right? Small marketers, retailers. They are actually competing on brand, on creativity, and on cultural influence on a global scale. That's quite different from what we perceive as Chinese firms. So, is this new generation of Chinese entrepreneurs different from the previous generations? What's your read on that?
There is still, I think, a lot to be said about the manufacturing
Mm,
capacity.
mm, mm,
Because if you look at this kind of this toy market, it began kind of in Hong Kong, and they relied a lot of the artists. They before they became really big, they still have to make ends meet. So they would make their sculptures and painting in 3D forms and in a kind of manufactured format and smaller sculptures. And they relied on a lot of the Dongguan factories to be able to create these molds in a cost efficient and also quick way so that they are catching on to the wave of what's popular, the Chaowan market. And that is key because if you're able to create these molds of these characters in lots of different designs quickly and cheaply, then you're able to sell them and then you could test them. The cost of testing is not too high, so you're able to get a sense of what's popular in the market, and then that process becomes how you will be able to make this hit item. And every hit character probably has, hundreds of kind of failed ones behind it. So I think Pop Mart, it definitely still relies on that manufacturer and that iteration capacity of the backbone of the Chinese factories, but it's also cementing a new thesis, right? Is that Chinese founders can now compete on creativity and taste because they have a ready market to test and to give you immediate feedback on what they like and what they don't like. And that is something I think is a very, very big advantage for a lot of these founders. I think Wang Ning said in lots of different interviews and in his book that, he just asked online when Sony
mm,
Angels, right, made it so difficult for them to enter into every single new city required Pop Mart to get consent from the Sony Angel parent company, and that became untenable. And Wang Ning just asked on Weibo, it's like, what are your like favorite characters? And that's how he discovered Molly. He
mm.
would go to these different toy expos and then see, which one has the longest lines there, and then just check out and see if they could sign the IP. So they also, because of China's large and ready market, they also have a lot of leverage when they're negotiating with up and coming artists
Mm.
on this is the market opportunity and would you like to sign with us? And that is something I think it's also the advantage of the size and the potential of the market. I think that gave Pop Mart a lot of leverage with the artists when they are trying to figure out what the next IPs are.
Yeah, fascinating. And as you know, a lot of Chinese firms are expanding overseas these days in search of blue ocean opportunities. What part of Labubu's success do you think is a lesson worth learning for them?
I think it's important to never underestimate the taste-making power of these Chinese homegrown companies. When I went back to China this summer, I it was so clear to me because there are all these different product categories or consumption types. Coffee, for example, right? Starbucks made coffee into a lifestyle style commercial success. But you go to China and then you have all these new Chinese brand in coffee, and they just take something and completely run with it in a spectacular way. Like coffee in China, it's such a you could have the Luckin's and you could have like Manner, which is fast, quick, and great compared like in terms of the quality experience on par with Starbucks. But you also have a new crop of these very high-end, very kind of niche coffee shop that are popping up, the different roasting level and flavor profiles. They take coffee almost like and make it into almost like a cocktail, like experience.
Mm,
Like I just think there's something that is very underappreciated in the States. It's about like in China consumption because the consumers expect so much and the brands are willing to give it to the consumers that they just take an idea and they run with it and then kind of create something that is so quintessentially Chinese. And I think there's so many different examples. Sea Beauty is another one.
mm,
But I don't think it's talked enough in the US coverage and how we think about China as a consumer market. We just think that a lot of US brands, when they think about the Chinese market, they know how big it is, and then they
mm,
assume that they could still use their playbook overseas and to win in China. But the expectations and the kind of community building exercise of how that's done in China is it's on a different level and the expectations are very different. So I think go into the Chinese market with an open mind and
mm.
knowing that there is a much higher standards of what they expect from brands, I think it's a key thing and key takeaway.
Fascinating. But let me flip it a little bit. What do you see are the biggest failure modes or potential challenges you worry about, a company like Pop Mart and its pushes abroad? And how could they potentially hedge against those risks now as you see them?
I think the counterfeit could be a
Mm,
problem because there is just so much demand for the products. But over the summer, because I could never get my hands on a Labubu, and I have to get a Labubu because I'm doing research, and I asked around, and there's actually a new crop of daigous that have really come into existence to sell Labubus, and you never know if they're real or not. So like initially, I was a little skeptical about buying from just some WeChat person on the other end. I don't know where they get their Labubus, but every single Labubu on the actual doll, not on the box, has a QR code that you could scan.
mm,
You could scan in WeChat mini program, and then it will tell you if it's authentic or not. And that actually, I was very surprised by that because that takes an incredible amount of resources and investment to be able to make sure that every single Labubu dolls has a QR code, and you'll be able to check if it's authentic just by simply scanning it. So
mm,
that kind of 溯源, I think they're pretty serious about making sure that counterfeit doesn't become a a thing that takes down the whole entire hype of the moment. But I am a little bit worried about kind of this scarcity that is there because for all of the um, potential consumers that want a Labubu, there's also lots of different options that they have. I think a couple of years ago, Jellycat was having a moment in China, and everybody was crazy over Jellycat. And then before that, that was Disney's Lina Bell. There's all these different kind of plush toy characters that had a moment in the spotlight, and then they kind of just fade away. And recently, I read in the Financial Times that Miniso, right, one of Pop Mart's China-based competitor, who's also aggressively expanding overseas, is creating its own kind of competing character, if you will, to Labubu, Wa Kuku. So there's just no shortage of these characters that customers can buy, and there's isn't a lot of customer loyalty there. So the scarcity may create a scenario where they just lose the entire market altogether because the potential consumer that haven't been brought into the fold just move on to something else.
Mm, fascinating. And speaking of challenges and potential risks, many Chinese consumer brands today, as you know, face scrutiny on sustainability, labor practices, and counterfeiting, as you mentioned. So, in addition to the counterfeiting issue, when it comes to sort of geopolitical tensions, global scrutiny over labor practice, sustainability, how is Pop Mart doing, and how are they handling those potential reputational challenges?
I think they have to take a very different approach when they are in China and versus when they're going to European market and
Mm,
US market because the to me, it's all about how ripe the market in terms of cultivated market for the economy of cute. If you look at Japan, there's already like Sanrio that, that in Japan, people are very used to different characters and these kind of cute things. And versus like in the US and in Europe, there is definitely a ready customer base for that. But compared to APAC, which is still, in terms of global revenues, PopMart is still seeing a lot more successes in APAC market and Southeast Asia. So to be able to educate the overseas customers and to understand what their touch points are, to reach them. And also Lisa was kind of the person who made PopMart into the global phenomenon that it is. So who are like the equivalent to Lisa star power in Brazil or
mhm.
in France? I think having those very organic, authentic influencer 带货 to be
Yeah.
able to be advocate and vouch for these products, I think is going to be key in sustaining that success abroad. I think it was over the summer, right? Michelle Yeoh showcased her like shrimp tempura Labubu, and that was such a cultural moment. And now you see that Casing Lun is doing a collab with Monet, which is a luxury leather brand, and the spokesperson and the brand ambassador is Michelle Yeoh. So there's a lot of kind of interconnectedness in how the brand Pop Mart, which is separate from Labubu. I think Labubu is also taking on a life of its own and doing different collabs with different luxury brands. And how do they still stay in the discussion, stay in our public consciousness and on social media that there's still chatter about it will be key in sustaining that growth going forward.
Fantastic. And, stepping back a little bit, how do you see US policymakers reacting to not just an export, but a cultural export like Labubu, like Pop Mart? Is there a risk that Labubu could potentially get caught in the same geopolitical crossfire that has hit, say, TikTok?
I personally don't think there's a lot of connection because for TikTok, really the core of the conflict or the challenge is um, place of data, the data ownership
Yeah.
and the algorithm. Um, I can see that if there's a lot of kind of community level of membership building abroad, there is some customer data, but I think it's on a very different level from
Yeah.
what TikTok is going through still at the moment.
Yeah. And just stepping back a little bit. So if you think of Chinese soft power in general, right? Traditionally we think of those in terms of, state-backed efforts like CGTN, Confucius Institutes. But honestly, they didn't really land with the global audience. But now we're looking at something very different. We're looking at a private consumer brand potentially shaping global culture, or at least shaping global culture among the Gen Z, the young, the youth, right? How does Pop Mart fit into this broader story of China's emerging cultural export? Could this be China's K-pop moment of its own?
Mm. I think it's worthwhile to dig into how Pop Mart talks about the characters, right?
Mm,
It calls them IPs. And I think it's really interesting because IPs are actually, even though it's like two English letters, like alphabet letters, but it's actually very hard to translate it in the
yeah.
Western like awareness and context because in like IP in Western context, there's a very specific legal meaning to what that is, intellectual property. But IP in China and the way that Pop Mart talks about it, it really just is like a content, an idea, which makes it really easy to stretch across different categories.
Mm,
Because the concept can be, can evolve into there could be a whole anime series about the whole universe of Labubu because we know that Labubu is just one part of this storyline that Casey Long has created. There's Tai Coco, there's Zmomo, there's Mokoko, there's like a whole universe of these characters that is now, right now it's used in Pop Mart's like Disneyland like a theme park. But there's so much possibilities of what you can take that. And the soft power aspect that you mentioned, it is fascinating because it seems like it's quite organic, right? It's
yeah.
just it happens that Lisa just really loves her Labubu and Crybaby and talked about it in one of the interviews. And then
Mhm.
suddenly everybody is all over it. And then you have a lot of other celebrities catching on. And what I find it fascinating is the ability of Labubu as a newsmaker. That you attach anything. We could be in US Open season and suddenly somebody bejewels Labubu and that becomes the news itself. So the soft power lies in how the affiliation with these characters, with these kind of culturally relevant zeitgeist of like products, it could create news. And that is soft power. And that is something that you're right, CGTN and a lot of these kind of cultural experts haven't been able to do because I think Labubu is still, to me, as I look at it, it's quite an organic phenomenon. And how do you maintain this organic and authentic vibe about this whole phenomenon? I think is key for its continued success.
Yeah, fantastic. This authenticity, I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
Precisely because it's not forced. It's not state dictated. That's, it has this natural appeal to it. Finally, Ivy, thank you so much for walking us through this fascinating case. It might look like a quirky figurine, but as we discussed, Labubu actually embodies, I think, much bigger questions about China's changing consumer culture, China's entrepreneurial dynamism, and this new found global influence that's organic and authentic. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us in this quick first episode of Finding Labubu. We'll be back with more conversations about how Chinese brands, icons, innovations are shaping not just Chinese economy, but also the way the world sees China. Until then, I'm Lizzi Lee. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.